A black woman boards a routine flight to Seattle, just hoping for a quiet trip. But when a veteran pilot questions her right to sit in first class, everything changes. He belittles her, dismisses her concerns, and tries to make her feel small. What he doesn't know: she's one of the FAA's top consultants. Just hours later, he's grounded, and what happens next sends shockwaves through the entire airline industry. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if this story moves you, be sure to subscribe for more powerful real-life justice stories. It all started with what seemed like just another flight. The morning air inside Chicago O'Hare was thick with departure, with hope, with haste. Black coats brushed past blacker thoughts, and the people moved, each of them pulled forward by necessity, obligation, or routine. But one woman moved differently. She did not walk with haste. She walked with certainty. Her name was Claudia West, and she bore the same calm as the wing of a seasoned aircraft, steady, tested, never shaken by turbulence anymore. Dressed in a navy blazer that spoke without speaking, Claudia was not only an aeronautical engineer but a federal consultant for the FAA, a regulator in an industry dominated by men and, even more so, by whiteness. She had learned, early and often, that her presence alone was enough to disturb people who believed the skies belonged to them. This was not her first flight of the week, nor her last. Seattle called her for business, something about new safety protocols, a working group with Boeing, a few quiet checks that would ripple loudly across policy. But that morning, Claudia was not thinking about policy. She was thinking about coffee. She moved to the kiosk like anyone else, exchanged currency for a cup of heat, and sipped as if to confirm, today would be ordinary. But black folks in America, especially women, know what the rest of the country forgets. An ordinary day can turn extraordinary in the space between two glances. At gate 19, she opened her laptop and began answering emails. She was seated beside an elderly white man with a paperback novel about war and peace and nothing in between. On her other side, a teenage girl scrolled TikTok with the abandon of someone not yet trained to look over her shoulder. Claudia belonged there as much as anyone, yet she felt the eyes. Always the eyes. When the gate agent announced the boarding of first class for Delta Flight 882 to Seattle, Claudia gathered her things and stood, not with pride, but with ease. Her seat was 2A. A window. Always a window. She had earned that seat 100 times over. But she knew from experience, no seat on a plane was ever truly hers. Not to them. She stepped into the fuselage like a woman entering a courtroom, calm but prepared to defend her presence. The flight attendant, a young man named Corey, greeted her with a smile that was real. He offered to stow her bag, and she nodded politely. A brief exchange. No friction. Not yet. It was when she settled into her seat, and the other passengers trickled in, that the air began to shift. Not because of anything she did, but because of who was about to arrive. Captain Edward Mallory had the posture of a man who'd forgotten what it meant to serve. He walked through the cabin like a judge inspecting a gallery. Gray in the temples, stiff in the mouth, and heavy in the eyes, he looked at passengers not with welcome, but with assessment. When he saw Claudia, his pace slowed, but only slightly. A flinch almost happened, but he buried it with a nod to the co-pilot and ducked into the cockpit. Claudia didn't look up. Not then. But she felt it. That gaze, the kind that doesn't ask a question, but presumes the answer. She tried to return to her notes, but a whisper of intuition tugged at her collar. She knew the feeling. The one that said, "Brace yourself. The sky may be smooth, but the man flying the plane is not." And sure enough, not 10 minutes later, Captain Mallory reappeared, not to adjust instruments, not to offer assurance, but to do what so many men in his position do when faced with a black woman in first class: question her. "Excuse me," he said flatly, standing just above her with arms crossed. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Claudia blinked, then handed it over without expression. She had nothing to prove, but in America, dignity is something you carry in your breast pocket, ready to be displayed on demand. He stared at it longer than necessary. "You're in 2A on business?" "Yes," she said. "Is there a problem?" "No," he replied, but his tone said otherwise. "Just making sure you're where you're supposed to be. We get a lot of seat upgrades that aren't authorized. Hard to keep track sometimes." Claudia smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That's why the boarding passes are scanned." He didn't laugh. He just turned away, disappearing into the cockpit as silently as he had come. There it was. The ritual had begun. What followed wasn't dramatic, not yet. But Claudia knew enough of history, enough of the world, to understand that danger rarely arrives with fanfare. It comes quietly, in sideways glances, in clipped questions, in the presumption of guilt hidden beneath the guise of protocol. She wasn't afraid, but she was prepared. Because this wasn't just about a seat. It never is. The plane had yet to lift off, but already the air inside felt pressurized, not from altitude, but from silence. That dangerous kind of silence, the one that doesn't signal peace but restraint. A silence you learn to sit with when you're Black in America, especially in a space that was never built for your comfort. Claudia adjusted the strap of her bag beneath the seat, then reached for her tablet, feigning distraction. But her mind was no longer in the numbers or protocols. It hovered just behind her eyes, replaying the pilot's tone, flat, clipped, needling. The kind of tone that said, "You may be in that seat, but don't get too comfortable." She had been here before. Not this plane, not this city, but this posture of suspicion. This burden of performance. A Black woman doesn't just fly, she testifies, with every glance, every word, every breath. Captain Mallory had returned to the cockpit, yet his presence lingered. The kind of man who measured authority by how many people bent before him. And Claudia, seated where she was, unbothered and unbent, must have been a pebble in his polished boot. Passengers filed in now, and the flight crew made their rounds, polite smiles stitched into duty. The aisles buzzed with soft conversations, zippers, tray tables clicking into place. A white man too rose back, joked about delays, saying, "These planes are built faster than they're maintained," to the amused chuckle of his seatmate. Claudia raised her eyes. She knew irony when she heard it. The woman across from her, a pale-skinned executive type with a silk scarf and knowing smirk, was watching. Not rudely, not obviously, but watching nonetheless. Claudia felt it, like a draft from an open window. And then came the second moment. Subtle, as they always are. A flight attendant, different from the first, approached. She looked young, nervous, uncertain if she was asking or obeying. "Ma'am," she said, "I'm just double-checking seat confirmations." Claudia looked up slowly. "I already showed my pass." To the captain. The attendant fidgeted. "Yes, he just asked me to reconfirm." The girl looked embarrassed. Claudia felt something inside her tighten. Not anger. Anger was too easy. It was a remembrance. This was the old dance again. The chain of command rolling downhill, always stopping at the neck of the one who cannot protest without being labeled angry or difficult. Still, Claudia pulled out her boarding pass. Again. "Thank you," the girl said, barely audible. And she walked away like a person escaping a mistake they didn't mean to make. Claudia leaned back. Her breath was steady, but her pulse was not. She scanned the faces around her. Nobody said a word. You see, the problem with racism isn't just the wound, it's the silence around the wound. It's how folks will watch you bleed and call it procedure. The captain's voice came over the intercom then. Cheerful, polished. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're clear for takeoff. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." Claudia closed her eyes, not in rest, but in steel. Relaxation was a luxury. One she could afford, but never indulged. The plane taxied down the runway, the engines rumbling beneath her like an accusation. And as they lifted into the sky, Claudia reminded herself of something her mother once said while ironing a uniform for her first job: "You may rise, but they'll always test how high they'll let you go." And today, it seemed, someone intended to test her. Not with words, but with glances, with procedural harassment, with the suggestion, unspoken but clear, that her presence in first class disrupted the natural order. They had no idea who she was, but they were about to find out. The plane cut through the sky like a quiet blade. A few thousand feet above the land, people became abstractions, their concerns smaller, their tempers oddly larger. But inside the cabin, power remained very much intact, and it had a face, a voice, and a uniform. Captain Mallory spoke again, overhead now, distant but still pressing down. "We've hit a patch of minor turbulence. Please remain seated." His voice was calm, official, and, for Claudia, unmistakably condescending. He sounded like a man who expected compliance not out of necessity, but obedience. The woman across the aisle finally broke the silence. "You handled that little scene earlier well," she said, as if offering a compliment. "It's unfortunate when things get misread." Claudia turned, her tone even but laced with weight. "Misread?" The woman's smile held. "You know, the pilot is just doing his job. Sometimes people take things the wrong way." Claudia didn't respond at first. She looked out the window where clouds passed like whispers. "The wrong way," she finally said, "usually means the honest way, but not the comfortable way." The woman looked away, chastised not by volume, but by truth. It wasn't just what had happened with the pilot. It was the aftermath. The whispers. The lingering eyes. The silent alignment that turned the burden of proof onto Claudia, as if her very presence now needed justification. Then came the drink service. The flight attendant offered the man next to Claudia a glass of bourbon with a smile. To Claudia, water, unasked. She declined it, not out of thirst, but principle. A few rows back, a passenger, a black man in coach, stood up to stretch his legs. Within seconds, another attendant was by his side. "Sir, we ask that passengers stay seated during turbulence." Her tone was curt, even though the fasten seatbelt sign had been off for minutes. He complied. "Sit down slowly." No words, just that familiar bow of self-preservation. Claudia watched it unfold. Watched how normal it had all become. The script played out like a stage production everyone knew by heart. The accusation, the defensiveness, the silent shame, and the whiteness of the script never got questioned, just the reactions of those asked to play parts they never auditioned for. Another announcement came. This time, the pilot's voice held a strange edge. A reminder to all passengers that disruptive behavior will not be tolerated at any altitude. Our cabin crew is here for your safety, not to debate procedures. There was no incident. No need for such a warning. But Claudia heard the message for what it was. It was not a declaration. It was a warning disguised as policy. It said, "Know your place. Don't rise higher than the seat you paid for." She closed her eyes. The hum of the plane felt louder now. Not in sound, but in meaning. She thought of her grandfather, who had never flown in his life, but told her once, "They'll always be shocked to find you sitting where they've never imagined you belong." And here she was, still proving she had the right to belong. Still breathing under the weight of someone else's discomfort. Still rising, seatbelt on, pride intact, and justice not yet spoken. But it would be. Because altitude never changes gravity. And the truth? It always finds its level. It was during the snack service that the real turbulence began, not in the sky, but in the cabin and, more particularly, in the unvoiced tremor between eyes that refused to see and those that had been forced to witness for far too long. The pretzels arrived late. The coffee is lukewarm. But the scrutiny, that arrived right on time. Claudia sat still, watching the flight attendant pause before handing her the same tray that had been given to the other passengers without question. A hesitation, subtle, fleeting, but undeniable. "Is this seat yours again?" the attendant asked with a strange, rehearsed curiosity, like someone feigning hospitality while reaching for authority. "Yes," Claudia answered softly, without blinking. "Same seat. Same ticket. Still mine." The attendant nodded, her face polite, but her eyes hunting, searching for a crack in the certainty. Claudia knew that look. It had lived in bank tellers, in department store clerks, in white mothers clutching their purses in elevators. It was the look that asked, "Are you sure you belong here?" It was the quiet audition that Black Americans had been performing since Reconstruction, silent proof of worth for an audience that never applauded. Across the aisle, a young white man in business attire reclined comfortably, shoes off, legs stretched into the aisle. Not a word from the crew. Not a sideways glance. He existed unquestioned, unbothered, untouched. Claudia, meanwhile, had adjusted her posture 3 times to avoid being perceived as too assertive, too comfortable, too much. And still, suspicion followed her like smoke. It was when the captain's voice returned that everything changed. "Attention passengers," he said, "we've received a cabin report of unusual behavior. We'll be doing a brief cabin walkthrough. Thank you for your cooperation." There was no confusion in Claudia's mind. That report had no source but fear. That unusual behavior had no evidence but her existence. Moments later, the co-pilot himself emerged, not the captain, but the second in command, likely sent to preserve plausible deniability. He wore the uniform like armor, every button a declaration of rank. He smiled, but not at her. He moved slowly down the aisle, eyes skimming every row, until he paused at hers. "Ma'am," he said in a tone that tried to be neutral, "have you experienced any disturbances on the flight?" Claudia looked up at him, the weight of history pressing against her ribcage. "No," she said, her voice firm. "But it seems I've become one." He hesitated. There it was again, that flicker of discomfort. Not guilt. Just surprised that she had the nerve to name what had only been whispered. He cleared his throat. "Just making sure everyone's safe." "Safety," she replied, "shouldn't feel like surveillance." And with that, she returned to her tablet. The co-pilot moved on, pretending not to register the tension he'd created, the spotlight he'd shown. But the eyes in nearby rows, some sympathetic, some confused, some averted, had already drawn their conclusions. It was a strange kind of storm, one where the clouds never gathered outside, but rumbled low and thick inside the aircraft, between people who carried history in their skin and those who believed themselves innocent of it. The woman across the aisle shifted in her seat, finally sensing the weight of what she had earlier dismissed. The young man with his feet in the aisle pulled them in. Small gestures, late realizations. The flight pressed on, but so did Claudia's solitude. Not in the physical sense, she was surrounded by people, but in a deeper, colder way that only those who have been made by others can know. The kind of solitude that sits beside you like a shadow, asking you to prove yourself again, in silence, without raising your voice. Outside, the clouds parted. But inside, the weather still hadn't cleared. And Claudia, still seated, still composed, felt every mile the plane traveled as a reminder, even 35,000 feet in the air, blackness does not get to the coast. There's something insidious about the way black dignity gets measured in white discomfort. It was somewhere over the Colorado plains when Claudia first noticed it, how the air had changed not in pressure, but in temperature. The cabin wasn't colder, but she was. It was the freeze that comes not from altitude, but from suspicion, the kind that creeps in when people begin to murmur low, avert their eyes, or look at you too long and say nothing at all. The co-pilot never returned. No follow-up, no explanation. His absence spoke louder than his presence. It said, "We've seen what we wanted to see. Now let's pretend nothing happened." But the quiet grew louder. A flight attendant began to hover near her row. Not with concern, no, that would have been too kind, but with the practiced smile of someone who was trained to manage situations. And Claudia, in their eyes, had become just that, a situation. A disturbance with a name, a seat number, and a skin color they couldn't unsee. "Can I get you anything?" the attendant asked. "No, thank you." A beat. Then, "Would you like to move to the back row? It's more private there." Claudia turned, slowly. The kind of slow that lets you decide if you're going to set a fire or walk away from one. "I paid for my seat," she said, her tone level. "I'm staying in it." The smile on the attendant's face didn't falter, but it froze. It was the kind of smile white folks have given black folks for centuries. "I'm smiling, so this can't be a racist smile. The asterisk lets not make this uncomfortable for me to smile." "I understand," the attendant replied, and walked away. But the message had been sent. Don't get too comfortable. We still decide where you sit. Now, if you're a black woman of a certain age, or of any age really, you learn to carry 2 suitcases, the one with your belongings and the one packed tight with restraint. Claudia clutched both now. She felt the weight of every incident before this, every delay at a gate, every mispronounced name, every "is this your seat?" when the real question was, "Are you sure you belong here?" She was tired. Not of the flight, but of the fight. And yet she sat there, shoulders square, eyes forward, breath deep, dignity undisturbed, but bruised all the same. A few rows ahead, 2 men whispered while glancing back. One chuckled under his breath. Claudia could hear fragments, "FAA, seat upgrade, making a scene." What none of them knew, what they hadn't asked to know, was that Claudia had logged more hours in airport inspection reports than the pilot had in the sky. She had rewritten policy on safety compliance and had once uncovered a maintenance oversight that saved lives. But here she was, being treated like turbulence in a dress. It wasn't about the seat. It never was. It was about the fear that a black woman might carry more than just a handbag, might carry authority, might carry power, might carry witness. And there is nothing more frightening to the insecure than a witness with credentials. The drink cart rolled by again. This time, the attendant skipped her row. Claudia didn't flinch. She pulled out her notebook instead, not the work one, not the FAA binder full of spreadsheets and acronyms, but a smaller one. The kind she used for moments like this. Quiet documentation. Names. Times. Glances. Phrases. She had learned, long ago, that black people don't just live through racism, we record it, because nobody believes it otherwise. She was halfway through writing the phrase suggested to move seats, no cause stated, when the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain," came the voice. "We've received a request from the flight deck to verify passenger seating. Please remain seated while we conduct a brief check." There was a pause in the air, a stillness that had nothing to do with altitude. It was a lie, and Claudia knew it. The kind of lie wrapped in protocol, dressed up as procedure. The kind of lie you can't challenge without being labeled uncooperative. The kind that black folks have been forced to swallow with a smile since plantations taught politeness under the lash. So she sat still, watching. Another attendant came by. This one was younger, nervous, glancing at a clipboard. "Miss Howard, is it?" "Yes. We just need to confirm." "I'm in seat 3A. Confirmed at boarding. No changes. No discrepancies." The attendant swallowed hard, nodded, and moved on. It was a theater of control. A performance in which she had not auditioned, yet had been cast. And the audience, well, they watched with that uniquely American discomfort, aware something unjust was happening but unwilling to name it. By now, the rhythm of the flight had been replaced by something else, the rhythm of a reckoning. One that hummed quietly through the air vents and settled heavy in Claudia's chest. She turned again to her notebook and wrote just 3 words. Still not safe. Not even up here, beyond the clouds. Not even with a ticket. Not even with a title. Because safety, like dignity, in America has always been conditional. And some of us were born with the terms and conditions written in blood. There's a moment, just a breath before the break, where silence becomes unbearable. Where the weight of being watched becomes heavier than any storm in the sky. That was the moment Claudia found herself in. The plane had leveled off at 36,000 feet, but inside that metal body, something else was descending. The calm was gone. In its place, that thick, stifling air of unspoken accusation. The kind of air older black folks know well. It doesn't scream at you, it whispers. It doesn't slap, it smiles and asks if you're all right. Claudia had been through too many seasons of this country to miss the signs. The co-pilot still hadn't returned. The lead attendant, Sandra, came by, this time without even pretending it was about drinks or snacks. "I just want to make sure you're feeling comfortable, Ms. Howard," she said softly, her voice laced with something that might have been pity or fear, or both. Claudia looked at her carefully. "Why wouldn't I be?" Sandra hesitated. Her eyes darted to the back of the cabin. "No reason, just, we've received some feedback. From the cockpit. The captain thought you might be, well, unsettled." Claudia smiled then, not out of amusement, but survival. It was the kind of smile that held back an entire lifetime of memories. The kind you wear when you know that anger won't be heard, only punished. "I'm not unsettled," she said. "I'm just seated." Sandra didn't know what to do with that. So she nodded, apologized, and walked away. Claudia returned to her notebook. The pen glided over the paper like a blade. "Captain has concerns. About me, but not the aircraft. It would have been funny if it weren't so familiar. Now, if you are over 65 in this country, if you've walked this American earth long enough, you know what happens next. You've seen it in courtrooms, lunch counters, classrooms. You've seen the escalation. Not loud, not fast, but steady, like a rope being slowly pulled tighter around the throat of dignity. The next step came as a request, thinly veiled, delivered by a junior attendant who looked barely old enough to vote. "Ma'am," he said, "would you mind moving to the last row of first class? It's a little quieter there." There it was. Not because of anything she did. Not because of policy. But because, in the eyes of a pilot still nursing his own fragile command, Claudia was no longer a passenger, she was a threat. A question mark in a world that prefers its answers to be white and silent. "I prefer to remain where I am," she said, not unkindly. The young man opened his mouth as if to object, then thought better of it. He stepped back. But the seed had been planted. She watched the dance of the other passengers, the way they avoided eye contact, the way some whispered into phones. One woman took a photo. A man 3 rows back muttered, "Unbelievable," under his breath. Claudia couldn't tell if it was about her or the situation. That was the cruelty of it. Racism in 2025 didn't wear a hood or spit in your face. It said "ma'am" and called security. And that's exactly what it did. As if choreographed, the lead attendant reappeared minutes later, her voice lower now. "Ms. Howard, the captain has requested to speak with you in private. Just a quick conversation. Nothing formal." Claudia laughed softly, not out of joy but recognition. "I've had a lifetime of informal conversations that changed everything," she said. "If he has something to say, he can say it here." Sandra was stuck. She didn't have the power to push back, not against the man behind the locked door up front. So she walked away. For several minutes, the cabin felt frozen in anticipation. Then came the crackle. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're beginning our initial descent into Los Angeles. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened." It was a calculated delay. Enough time for the plane to begin descending, but not enough for Claudia to raise an official complaint before landing. That's how they worked it. Always one step ahead of accountability. Always cloaked in protocol. But what Captain Whitaker didn't realize was that Claudia didn't need confrontation. She didn't need to yell. She didn't even need to stand. She had already written everything down. Time, name, tone, language, witnesses. She had receipts. As the wheels kissed the tarmac and the passengers exhaled, Thinking the worst was over, Claudia knew better. For people like her, the turbulence often came after the landing. She would disembark like everyone else. Calm, collected, professional. But her report? That would be loud. Because the sin here wasn't just in what was said, it was in everything the others stayed quiet about. It was in the man across the aisle who'd seen it all and said nothing. In the attendant who didn't question the request. In the company that would likely apologize and retrain and forget. But not her. Not this time. Because she knew, more than most, that in America, being quiet doesn't protect you. It only protects the system. Claudia Howard walked into the Los Angeles terminal with the grace of someone who had learned long ago to carry her burdens quietly. But don't confuse quiet for weak. She was, in that moment, like a storm gathering its strength just offshore, seen by few, understood by fewer, but certain to arrive. The air in the terminal was different. Too cool, too clean. Sanitized. It smelled of surface-level order, and that same scripted, we care about your comfort nonsense that always rings false once you've been seen as a problem instead of a passenger. She didn't speak to anyone as she walked, not yet. The moment would come. But first, she needed stillness. A place to collect her thoughts, her notes, and that rarest American resource, proof. In a quiet corner of the lounge, her fingers moved over the screen of her tablet with the precision of a woman who had been documenting injustice long before hashtags made it fashionable. She wasn't just angry. She was organized. She had screenshots, timestamps, the names of 2 flight attendants, both of whom had witnessed the pilot's concerns escalate without cause. She had the audio recording from the intercom announcement, veiled with just enough emphasis to carry weight, but not enough to carry consequences. Not yet. But she was about to change that. Because here's the thing, when you are black and female in this country, especially with a title, especially with a resume, they don't always hang you for shouting. Sometimes, they try to bury you for daring to speak softly with authority. It was mid-afternoon when she walked into Delta's terminal office with her FAA credentials around her neck. The young man at the desk looked up, startled. He asked if she had an appointment. "I don't," she said. "But your captain tried to make one with my dignity at 36,000 feet. The receptionist paled, then offered her a seat. Within 10 minutes, she was speaking with a supervisor. And just like that, the slow game of deflection began. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry you feel this way." She tilted her head. "I didn't come for an apology. I came for accountability." There was a moment of stillness. The kind that falls over a room when someone realizes they're no longer dealing with a complaint, but a reckoning. The supervisor, a white man in his 50s with thinning hair and a clipboard he didn't seem to need, sighed. "Do you have evidence?" She opened her tablet. Photos. Notes. The FAA policy number on passenger treatment. The precise code for safety violation protocols that had been breached when her concern about the electrical systems was ignored. "I've already submitted a report to the FAA," she said. "This is your opportunity to get ahead of what comes next." He blinked. Is this about race?" She looked him dead in the eye. "This is about power. The kind that believes it can ignore a professional's voice when it doesn't come from the mouth it expects. The kind that lets a man with 10,000 flight hours think he's above regulation. And yes, race is woven through all of that." The man nodded slowly, uneasily. "Promised an investigation. Promised follow-up. Promised, in short, the things institutions promise when they hope time will silence the witness." But Claudia had lived through too much to fall for paper shields and polished lies. She left the terminal with her head held high, but her soul bracing for what came next. That night, in her hotel room, she received the first call. A contact at the FAA. Someone who owed her a favor. "Claudia," the voice said, "they're talking about it in the upper levels already. Your name's circulating. Quietly. You've kicked a hornet's nest." She nodded to herself. "Good," she replied. Maybe now someone will listen before someone dies midair next time. The next morning brought the first press inquiry. A reporter from an independent outlet, someone who'd seen a tweet, maybe caught a whisper. They wanted confirmation. She declined to comment, but the fire had been lit. The pilot, Captain Whitaker, had no idea that every email he'd ever sent, every incident report he'd tried to bury, was being pulled up. That's the thing about prejudice. It always thinks it's an island, untouched, hidden, until the tide goes out. Meanwhile, Claudia kept working. Speaking at a conference, mentoring a younger Black engineer, reviewing specs on a new guidance system for takeoffs. She wasn't defined by that flight. But she wasn't done with it either. Because every day, there was a new email. A quiet thank you. A story from another woman, Black, brown, or otherwise, who'd been belittled in the sky. An engineer who'd raised a concern and been ignored. A steward who feared losing his job if he reported a racist captain. The rhythm of injustice had always been steady. What Claudia did was shift the tempo. The system was stirring now, reluctantly. But that was enough. Sometimes, change doesn't arrive with a bang. It arrives through someone like her, a Black woman, seated, quiet, watching, waiting, until the moment comes to stand. And in that moment, all those years of being told to wait your turn, to keep your voice down, to stay in your place, they fall away. Because that place? It never belonged to them to assign. The news broke on a Wednesday. Midweek, when people are too tired to lie to themselves and too busy to pretend they didn't see it. The headline ran beneath a photo of Claudia Howard in mid-step, tote bag slung over her shoulder, the faintest trace of resolve on her lips. FAA consultant grounds veteran Delta pilot after discriminatory incident and ignored safety alert. It was never just about the seat, or the sideways comment, or the question that no other passenger had to answer. It was about the lie we tell ourselves in this country, that if a Black woman is polite enough, credentialed enough, calm enough, then her presence will be accepted without suspicion. Captain Whitaker had not read that lie. He had lived it, believed it. And when it failed him, when the woman he tried to reduce turned out to be someone who could rewrite his future, he realized what many before him have learned the hard way. Prejudice is not a shield. It's a trap. And sometimes when the trap closes, it catches the wrong man by the hand. By Friday, he was suspended. Unpaid. Under federal review. Delta issued a statement that used the right words: sensitivity training, commitment to inclusion, employee conduct under review, but the damage was done. The passengers who had witnessed it began to post online. A thread from a young woman who had seen the pilot confront Claudia was retweeted over 200,000 times. A father who had been seated across the aisle uploaded a blurry photo of Claudia helping his child retrieve a toy that had rolled under the seat. "This is who the pilot tried to remove," he wrote. "And she's the only reason we're all still safe." It went viral. And that terrified the airline more than any internal audit ever could. But this wasn't about vengeance for Claudia. This wasn't about dragging a man down. She'd said it plainly in her interview with the FAA, "I don't want his job. I want the job done right." In the weeks that followed, the FAA launched a broader investigation into cockpit decision-making under bias pressure. The stories spurred conversations on CNN, in union boardrooms, at travel symposiums, and even over kitchen tables. Older Black veterans, some who had desegregated flight lines, others who remembered being denied commercial seats even in uniform, wrote to her. A retired Tuskegee airman sent a letter, handwritten and folded neatly. It read, "Sister, I was watching. You stood tall. You flew higher than any of us were ever allowed to. God bless you." Claudia framed that letter. Meanwhile, Delta began quietly rolling out mandatory racial bias response training for all flight crew. It was too late to undo the humiliation she endured in Seat 2A. But change, like justice, is often slow and late to arrive, but powerful when it finally does. And as for Captain Whitaker, he never issued a public apology. His lawyer advised against it. His union rep fought tooth and nail for reinstatement. But FAA records don't lie, and they now carry his name beside a line item no pilot wants to see, grounded pending bias-related safety incident. One evening, Claudia stood in a quiet terminal in Denver, waiting for a delayed flight. She wasn't traveling for work that day. She was going to see her niece's graduation. A man approached her. Middle-aged, tall, airline staff badge on his chest. "Miss Howard," he asked gently. "I just wanted to say, I was on that flight. I was in uniform. I saw what happened. I didn't speak up. I should have. I'm sorry." Claudia looked at him for a moment, not with anger, but with the quiet understanding of someone who's lived long enough to know that cowardice doesn't always look like hate. Sometimes it's silent. Sometimes comfort is mistaken for safety. She nodded. "Then speak up next time." And with that, she walked to her gate. The terminal lights buzzed above. The floor is still too polished, the announcements still too cheerful. But something had shifted. The system that had once tried to erase her had been forced to write her name in permanent ink. And all it took was a black woman who refused to shrink.